Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen, and today we're going to discuss the subject of should Canadians get a second passport? And this is particularly noteworthy given the fact that there's been a bunch of changes going on in Canada that has a lot of people upset and concerned. I've had some, very successful older people who have lived in Canada their entire life, have no desire really to leave, but are deeply concerned about the direction of things. And so as a Canadian myself, I figured I would weigh in on this subject for you because I have traditionally given people a certain set of advice. I'll talk about that in the past and the reasoning for it and what I'm advising to people right now. So let's dive in. Before we do, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the all notification bell. Thank you for your support. If you'd like help with relocating internationally, getting second residencies, citizenships, setting up some sort of a plan B, optimizing your taxes, paying the lowest legal amount of tax possible, setting up companies, opening bank accounts, etc., please reach out to me. You can book a call, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below. Or you can send a message through our websites, offshorecitizen.net and offshorecapitalist.com. All right, so let's talk about Canadians and getting a second citizenship. So the context here is that Canada's got a great citizenship. You have a fantastic passport, you have a lot of visa-free access, definitely one of the top passports in the world in terms of access. Maybe the places that you would like to have access to in a normal case that you wouldn't would be, Schengen access, a kind of EU passport option, or maybe China, but otherwise it's the best access in the world to the US. It's the only place that doesn't need to have to go through ESTA, and so that's pretty cool. It has access to, all the major places that a person would typically want to go, like UK and Ireland and Australia and New Zealand, Japan, Latin America, etc., Mexico. And therefore, is there a reason? Now, historically, when somebody would call me up, and some people who are Canadians have the mistaken assumption that in order to get out of the Canadian system, to leave Canada, to not pay Canadian taxes, they need to give up their citizenship. This is not true. A Canadian can retain their citizenship, they can retain their passport. It's a great passport, and most of the time there's no reason to get rid of it. And yet, there might be a lot of reasons to move away depending on what your personal preferences are. I obviously personally moved away a number of years ago. I lived on and off outside of the country prior to that, but officially left in 2017 and have been living abroad ever since, which I've talked a lot about in previous videos. What I think has changed today, if you were to ask an American, should they give up their citizenship, there's a pretty obvious reason why, which is that they have citizenship-based tax. I was just talking to somebody earlier today who'd got a US green card, thinking it was a great thing, and suddenly discover it's a terrible thing. They don't live in the US, they want to spend a minimal amount of time there, and we're enjoying a pretty optimized life, and suddenly their life is complicated by all kinds of US reporting obligations. They have to worry about things, even though they have nothing to do with the US, that are a downside. Canada doesn't have that. If you go and shift your tax residency abroad, you legitimately live somewhere else, although it's a little ambiguous how to do that, and it can be a little bit complex, and when you're leaving, there's an exit tax. Once you're out, you're pretty free. The problem is, increasingly, it has seemed like there's some crazy things happening in Canada. Some people may say it started with, there was a member of parliament from Ontario who suggested that there should be citizenship-based tax in Canada, and I personally consider that to be a ridiculous notion. I think there's a lot to be said that it is completely unjust. There's kind of like, if you're not benefiting from the ecosystem and the services, etc., then why should you be paying tax, right? What's the point here? Okay, you have the citizenship, and so there's a little bit of benefit there, but then again, it's not so easy to kind of get another one, etc. So, it's kind of what people are entitled to. And then on the flip side, if you want to argue that, hey, listen, you're taxing somebody on the basis of having the passport, then people who come there who don't have the passport and are just living in the country probably shouldn't be taxed the same amount. So it's hard to make that argument in a cohesive, logical, cognizant, consistent way that you should tax on the basis of citizenship. Now, generally speaking, I think it's highly unlikely that Canada is going to do citizenship-based taxation anytime soon. A big part of the reason for this is because of the fact that countries exist within a network of treaties, and the complexity of renegotiating those treaties is quite difficult. So there's a lot of conflicts that emerge. Canada in particular has a really large set of tax treaties. There's 92 double tax agreements, plus a bunch of tax information exchange agreements. And so it would be a complex thing to change. France, who is, they compete every year with Denmark to be the highest tax country in the world, did some research on it a few years back about the possibility of doing it, and they concluded it wasn't worth it. It didn't make sense because of all this network of tax treaties. So there are some people out there who are kind of fear-mongering and suggesting, citizenship-based tax is coming. I don't know that that's particularly likely. It's possible, obviously, but I don't know that it's necessarily that likely. What I do think is possible is that they do something like what you see in, for example, Portugal, for example, Spain, as well as some other countries where if you leave the country and you move to a low tax country or a tax haven, they will continue to tax you for a period of a few years. So that can affect you, depending, it's usually around 3 years, but in some cases it can be up to 10 years. So that's not very cool. Ireland has a system whereby if you remain domiciled in Ireland, and even though you're a non-resident, then there's some consequences there. There could be that sort of thing implemented. So there's a bunch of places that have some analog that would probably work and that they could end up doing. And this might be some incentive for somebody who's thinking, hey, should I get out now? Maybe you want to get out earlier if you're thinking you would want to leave anyway. But if on the other hand, you're not thinking you would want to leave anyway and you're just looking for backup, what should we be talking about? Well, here I think that my advice has changed. My advice used to be there's really not that much reason for you to have a second citizenship. You have to consider that, if you can get one, say, by descent, fantastic. Go ahead and get one by descent for sure. If you are in a situation where you're going to go and live in another country anyway and gradually build up to the criteria that you match, that it makes sense, you've lived there for, say, 5 years and you qualify, by all means, for sure, naturalize, get a second citizenship. But if you were talking about buying a citizenship, getting something in St. Kitts or, someplace like that, made a lot less sense because you're talking about typically $120,000 to $180,000 for one of those for a single person, more for a family. For most people, this is a fairly sizable investment. All right, if you're in the deca millions, then maybe it's a pretty small percentage of your net worth. If you're talking about, sub 1%, then as a cost of insurance, maybe not such a bad idea, especially if it gives you some added freedom that you want. But a lot of people, it didn't really make sense. I think today with the uncertainty, I'm increasingly suggesting that people who are wanting to think more globally and are in a situation where they think they may leave at some point and they are concerned about what's going on, that it may make sense to get a second citizenship. So talking quickly about what some of those options might be. The easiest, most accessible one typically is Turkey. You can get it for, $10,000, $20,000 in legal fees for a family or whatever, and you just have to buy a property that is $250,000 or more. Realistically, that can be any property, so you don't have to get ripped off on something, although a lot of people are selling rip-off properties. That's a whole other conversation. So, if you want to discuss that, you can reach out to me. That's not a bad way to go. The next thing that you could look at doing, of course, is doing something in one of the Caribbean countries. And so, like I said, you're talking about 120, slightly under 120,000 up to about 180,000 for a single person by the time you include all the fees. It's usually 100 to 150,000 donation. You can reach out to us and discuss it on what might work for you in that regard. There are other options, like you could, for example, go and invest some money in Dominican Republic and you could get citizenship after a couple of years there. Or if you're wanting to go and look at some place to live, you could go that route. Now, I have been a big advocate, and I continue to be a big advocate, that even if you're not going to get a citizenship, getting a residency, which costs a lot less and requires less commitment, less time, etc., is usually a good way to go. So I guess the bottom line is, in my opinion, it's getting to the stage where I think it's a wise diversification play for Canadians to have some sort of second citizenship and definitely a second residency. So for a lot of Canadians, the easiest second residency option is Mexico. It's pretty proximate, pretty much the same time zone, so that's workable. A lot of Canadians are familiar. It's a really common vacation spot. A lot of Canadians are down there, so you can have a good social circle, etc. But then there's some people in Costa Rica, some people in Panama, some people in other parts of Latin America, obviously people in the Middle East, Asia, Europe. So depending on what suits you. But I do think that there's a lot to be said for having multiple residencies today. And increasingly, Canada is in the basket of places that, although the passport at the moment is good, I think that having another one is probably a nice backup. Should you give up your Canadian citizenship? In my opinion, although I have a few clients who have made the decision to give up their Canadian citizenship, in my opinion, probably it's a little premature. I would not do that personally at this point in time. I think that it's a pretty valuable asset. Now, if you had, you're like, hey, I have Irish and, I don't know, one other one that are both good, then okay, then maybe it might make sense because you've got something else. But if you're in a position where it's your only tier 1 passport, I wouldn't give up a tier 1 passport for, say, a tier 3 passport. And so that's my opinion. Would love to hear what you guys think. Put it in the comments below. And I'm going to look forward to seeing you on the next video.